Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you to join us for our Hope for Creation's quarterly Green Team event on Congregations Can Compost. And of course, anyone can compost too, and we hope that people do. But today we're going to learn about how to compost, some tips for doing that, why it's important, and whatever else our speakers would like to share about how they think about composting. We welcome our 5 different speakers and all of you who came to participate. Hope for Creation has a mission statement, which you can take a glance at. We are a very active organization and have a lot of different things that we do. This quarterly congregational Green Team event is just one of the things that we do, and we try to provide topics that congregational green teams would find interesting and helpful and would like to learn about, and things that green teams within a congregation could possibly do at their own house of worship. So thanks for being here. Our speakers for today, you can see right there who all of our speakers are and who their organizations that they are affiliated with. So to begin, I would like to read a paragraph that I found in an article from our Presbyterian Hunger Program newsletter several years ago that I think is just fun, because I love compost and how it enriches the soil. And I heard somewhere someone estimated that at the rate at which industrial agriculture is depleting our soil, the world has about 60 years of soil. Oops.
Eileen, you muted yourself.
There we go. Sorry. The world has about 60 years of soil left. So it's crucially important that we keep composting and building up the soil and try to get that number down. Anyway, this is the paragraph from an article written by Stephen Bartlett. And he's talking about compost and says soil, but he means really rich soil that has lots of compost in it. This is what he says. One handful of soil contains hundreds of billions of microorganisms, not millions, but billions, thousands of species of bacteria, mostly unclassified. Working together, these bacteria create enzymes, hundreds of species of fungi and protozoa, dozens of species of nematodes, mites, and microanthropods. This doesn't even touch the creatures that we are familiar with, such as earthworms and other creatures that we observe. The combined work of this microecosystem has been characterized by soil scientists as exceedingly complex. So I think we all have a lot to learn about how the soil works, and what an actual miracle it is that the way it works together and creates nutrients for our plants to grow and therefore then nourish us. So we're just going to give each of our speakers a few minutes to talk about whatever they'd like to talk about connected with composting. And we're going to go in the order that was on the slide. So John Best will start.
So I live in Oshtemo Township in white oak savanna, which means there's no sunshine on our property. We get about 1 hour of sunshine a day in the summertime when the leaves are out. And so we don't have a vegetable garden here on our site. So we have a vegetable plot at the Voyager Garden at the Voyager Church in Oshtemo. And we also started a demonstration vegetable garden at the Westminster Church. And I see the congregation's vegetable gardens as a model that people would do at home. And so most of what I'm going to talk about is my work at the home, even Um, Oak leaves. I collect oak leaves because they need to get off the lawn. And instead of having somebody take them away, I put them in piles. I collect them, I put them in piles, and it takes about 2.5 years for them to decompose to use as mulch. I have seven piles. Fortunately, I have some forest or woods adjacent to my property. And so I go into the woods and dump them there. And I chop them up first by mowing them with the lawnmower. I don't collect them. And then I vacuum them up with what we bought a billy goat vacuum. And that chops them up some more. And so doing that reduces the time it takes to compost them from 2.5 years to a year or a year and a half. And so every year I utilize about 3 of my piles for moving the mulch onto the garden and flower gardens here on our site. And then I load them up into recycle bins that fit in the back of my car, and I take them to the garden to nourish the soil there. I use the leaf mulch to mulch under the tomatoes and peppers in particular, and other areas as well. You can buy compost activator for dry materials such as oak leaves, or for green compost. We do that, but I usually forget to use it. I'm learning to just rather live with Earth's schedule. And time is, they say that time is money, but I like to let nature do its work and live more within nature's rhythm. We have a compost tumbler, which we bought, which has 2 sides that we use for our vegetable scraps. I place that in our woods behind our property because they do attract mice. Every once in a while, I'm surprised when a mouse jumps out. And so rather than put that near the house, I put it at a distance. When they freeze up in the wintertime, I take a shovel out and I just bury the table scraps in the leaf piles and let nature take its course. I turn the leaf piles every so often with a pitchfork to let it air out. That also speeds the process. I'm not a scientist at this. I just do it and practice it. And you don't have to be an expert at this stuff. You can just do it. I place a tarp under the tumbler bins and dump it out, the compost when it's finished out into the tarp. Then I put the tarp into a recycle bin and put the recycle bin in a wheelbarrow, haul it to my car and move it around that way. Let's see. At the garden itself, I don't remove all of the plants in the wintertime when they're done. I tend to, if I'm raising corn or beans, I take a shears and I just chop it up in place and let the materials fall onto the garden itself. And that it decomposes over the winter and it becomes mulch for the next year. I can do that because I don't rototill. We believe in that it's best not to till as little as possible. I may turn the soil with a shovel if necessary. But it's important. I also, for the other plants, I sometimes, instead of putting them into a compost pile elsewhere, for the vegetable plants, when they're done producing, I put them into a pile in the corner of the garden plot and just take the shears or a machete and chop them up into as small pieces as I can, and just let nature take its course over the winter, and then spread out the pile in the spring. I don't, because of all this work, I don't buy any mulch. I don't buy a membership at a gym. I do this work as a replacement for doing that type of exercise. And it also, just to conclude, composting is a natural process of life, death, regeneration, and new birth. And it helps me reset my clock and my schedule to live in the rhythm of the Earth's natural schedule. And it takes time, and it slows me down. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a question in the chat that says, would the length of time for composting shorten if the piles were in the sun? I don't know the answer to that. So if anybody does, feel free to answer that in the chat. And I think we'd all like to know. We don't happen to have any sun at our house. So, but that may be a good possibility. Okay, I believe our next speaker, I don't know if I have the order right, is Janet.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say first what most of you probably already know, which is that composting reduces the volume of garbage and landfill. And that's one of the reasons that it's good for our planet and good for our community, our local communities. My husband and I have had an organic garden for decades, and we started composting in 1989. We have 2 compost bins. One is for new compost and the other is for older compost. So the baby compost is sort of decomposing, slowly. And then the older compost bin is stuff that we can use to till into our garden every spring. And it makes the soil very fertile and produces good yields of all sorts of fruits and vegetables and flowers and herbs in our garden. And we find that the local animals feel very safe in our yard. I don't know if they have some sort of animal newspaper or whatever, but I think they somehow sense that our yard is safe for them. We don't use pesticides. We don't use herbicides. We don't get paranoid if we have a few dandelions, and the animals often eat those anyway. Human beings can also eat dandelions. So it's, I think some people get too paranoid if they have a few dandelions and then they start spreading herbicides or pesticides or whatever. And I would just urge people not to do that, because you can put more of your yard scraps and waste into your compost if you avoid pesticides and herbicides. Because otherwise you'll just put those into your compost and you'll wind up eating pesticides and herbicides. So you don't really want to do that. Some materials take a long time to compost, as John was saying. For example, you can compost wood chips and twigs and branches, but they take a lot longer. So we just don't do that. We're sort of impatient to plow it into our garden. So we don't put things in the compost that take a very long time. And as to the question about whether compost is in sun or shade, I think it's more what you put into the compost. Certain materials just take a really long time to decompose. So if you're putting a tree branch into your compost, that could take years and years to decompose. So I would urge people not to do that unless you're creating a composting museum. Ours is not a museum. It's just for for plowing into, for tilling into our garden. We have simple rules for composting. it's mostly plants and eggshells that we're bringing to the compost. Some leaves, and John is quite right. If you're going to use oak leaves, they take a very long time to decompose. So you need to shred them and be very careful that they're fully decomposed, because they have tannin in them, and tannin discourages the growth of plants. So the oak leaves have to be decomposed enough so that the tannin is sort of leached out of them. Some composting guidelines say that you can use paper, but I urge people not to do that, because we already have, our local communities already pick up paper to recycle. So I really see no need to have to add that to the compost pile. So in general, what you want to focus on in your compost is material from plants. So this would be vegetable scraps like carrots, lettuce, celery, onions, tomatoes, broccoli, squash, pumpkins, etc. And it's good if you remove any paper or plastic labels that was on the produce when you bought it. If you didn't, we eat a lot of stuff from our own garden, so then obviously there are no labels involved. But if you do buy it from the store, I would remove any plastic or paper labels. So also fruit scraps, apples, oranges, berries, melons, plums, peaches, seeds, pits. And again, remove any paper or plastic labels from the produce. Cut grass, flowers, potted plants, and weeds can be put in the compost, but avoid doing that if there are any herbicides or pesticides on them. And avoid putting diseased plants into the compost, because they will spread the disease in the bin. Eggshells are good because they add calcium, which is an important mineral to the compost. Tea and coffee grounds can go in, but not the bags. Cooked or uncooked grains like wheat, oat, corn, oats, etc. can go in. But don't put in things like bread, because especially if our compost bin is open, and things like yeast are very bad for birds. So we don't put any bakery stuff into the compost bin. Items that should not be put into compost: no meat, fish, bones, oils, or dairy products, because these foods attract rodents and other pests. I mentioned that wood takes a really long time to break down, so we avoid putting that in the compost bin. If you do, I would use small wood chips, and make sure that the wood is not treated. Some wood is treated to be weather resistant, and you don't want those chemicals in your compost, because you'll wind up eating them eventually if you plow them into your garden. No styrofoam, plastic, or plastic coated materials, because these do not break down rapidly and they have chemicals that are harmful. No clothing, cotton balls or swabs, polyester or wool. There are people in our community who repurpose old clothes or tablecloths, and they make new garments out of them. So I would go that direction rather than putting clothing in your compost. You don't put pet waste or animal feces in compost, because it can contain harmful bacteria. Farmers treat those sorts of feces before they add them to their gardens, and their fields, and most individuals don't have those processing materials. So in general, don't put animal feces in your compost. No paper, cardboard, foil, plastic wrap, or plastic bags. And we have found that you want to really avoid adding the mushrooms you get in your yard to the compost, because they spread like crazy in the compost bin. So we avoid that. So that's basically our advice. But we really have gotten to the point that it's very hard for us to eat outside our home we feel sort of compelled to take the compost out, and you can't do that in a restaurant, you know, take a little bag of your eggshells from breakfast or whatever. People would look at you as if you were really weird, but we've gotten to the point we're so used to, we have a little compost container in our kitchen, and we fill it and empty it into our compost bins every day. So it is a little difficult when we eat out to sort of undo that practice. But we enjoy doing the composting, and it makes the garden really productive. So that's my basic advice.
Okay, thank you, Janet. Very, very helpful advice. Okay, Kimberly.
Well, I have to say to Janet, I have that same problem in restaurants. Sometimes I do want to take things home with me. In fact, the other day we were out somewhere and there was compostable cups or something, and I just kind of brought them home with me and tore them up for the compost. So you're not alone in that. I have been composting for about 20 plus years, different kinds of methods. And about 10 years ago, I took the Master Composter class out of Michigan State University. And from what I understand, they're going to offer that again sometime this spring. Look for that on MSU's website. It's a really good program. It's about 12 hours of education for that. So let's see, hang on a second. To the question of why is composting so important in a garden, you've already mentioned that, but my take is similar, but I'll just read you what I already wrote. To build healthier soils. So we want to return the nutrients from the foods we eat back into the soil. The compost is lighter and fluffier, so you're increasing the aeration in the soil and the moisture holding capabilities. And then to improve sandy or clay soils, which takes a lot of time. So the latest numbers from the EPA show that of all the materials in the landfill, 33.7% of all of the landfill waste is compostable. So it's either kitchen food waste or yard waste. So that's a big deal. So that's a lot of the reason I compost. I haven't always had a garden, but just keeping that out of the landfill is a huge priority for me. So how to make good compost? There's 4 components. As I see it, the organic materials, the leaves, the grass clippings, the kitchen scraps, you need air circulation, water, you need the microorganisms, which there are billions of. And so what you bring to that process is your 2 things, basically your carbons, which is an energy source and also a building material for cells. So the materials that are brown in general, brown and dry, your leaves and dried grass and cardboard are high in carbon. And for short, I tend to call those browns. The other component are the greens, which is nitrogens. Those are crucial for cell growth and for function. So that would be your green grass and your kitchen scraps and any plant clippings you might have. The good blend of those 2 elements is 3/4 carbon to 1/4 nitrogen. If you have too much nitrogen, your compost is probably going to smell. And if you have too high carbon, your pile is probably going to be too cool. So it won't cook the way that it's supposed to. So the way I make compost is to start in the kitchen. I take my onion and banana peels, apple cores, broccoli stems, watermelon rinds, things like that. Coffee grounds are big, tea bags. I have a small lidded compost bin that I have on my kitchen counter. And so I fill that up. It's only maybe a gallon size or something like that. So when that's full, I take it out to the bigger compost bin. What I've found is it doesn't smell and it doesn't tend to get flies or any problems when it's a small quantity in the kitchen. Sometimes in the summer, I have to put together some kind of a trap for the fruit flies because that just seems to be inevitable. But actually, after rereading this composting manual that I got from MSU, I'm realizing that I should take it out even more frequently to prevent those fruit flies from laying their eggs in my kitchen. So let's see. My outdoor composter is a circular one, and it's 3 feet high by 3 feet wide. A 1 cubic yard is what it is. And from what I understand, that size is recommended so the pile can heat up adequately enough to kill your weed seeds and things of that nature. So let's see. So the bin itself is round, but it's hinged. So I can take 1/2 of it out to get in and shovel and turn the compost and then put it back together. So it's a really handy design. I got it from Farm and Garden years and years ago. So of course they're not around anymore, but I'm sure you could find that style. It's probably pretty common. I envy the turning kind that John had mentioned. That sounds like a really great way to go. I have a lot of kitchen scraps in relation to my carbon. So sometimes I take cardboard and corrugated cardboard, things like that, and cut them up so that it adds a little bit more of that carbon to it. So after everything goes out into the compost bin outdoors, that's going to be the nitrogens and the carbons, and mix everything up and add a couple of shovels of regular soil from the yard, not too much because that'll slow things down too. So after a couple of days, check the temperature. There is such a thing as a compost thermometer. It's a really long one to get into the heart of the pile. I don't happen to have one of those, but if anybody's listening that wants to give me a birthday gift, that would be a good idea. But actually what I do right now is just touch the outside of it. It's going to feel warm. And if you want to, you can put your hand in the middle of it. And it should be, if things are going well, too hot to even touch. So that's what I'm shooting for. Although I have to admit that almost every single year, my New Year's resolution is to turn my compost more. I don't know why that's such an unsavory activity, but I'm just not very good at it. So a lot of times the compost that I make ends up being cold compost, which is a legitimate way of doing it. It's also called lazy composting. You'll end up getting your compost after about a year. So that only works if you can wait. I was just mentioning some methods for improving your compost, and I'm sure Dan will talk about some of that. So let's just leave it at that for me today.
Okay, thank you very much. Dan, if you'd like to go ahead, that'd be great.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm glad to be here talking about compost. I am currently professionally a stay-at-home dad. I have a 3-year-old daughter who I stay with full time. I am as Kimberly mentioned, lazy compost. I'm definitely in that category, a lazy composter. I have a background in organic farming, in gardening and permaculture. So before 2 years ago, before I started staying home full time, I worked for Western, managing the gardens at the Gibbs House for the Office for Sustainability. I've worked on farms, rural and urban, in Chicago and all around Michigan since 2006. I grew up gardening also. So, but I did not grow up composting. That's something I got interested in later in life. My compost at home kind of looks like this kind of system. It's a 2-bin, and we built our composter out of pallets, out of used pallets. So we have 5 pallets attached to each other, and we have slats in the front that we can put boards into to close the front up, but it's not real tight. In my kitchen, we kind of have 2 streams where our food scraps are going. We have chickens, we have 4 hens in our house. And so things that the chickens might like, we direct to them. And then eventually that ends up in the compost after it goes through the chickens. And then what the chickens don't like to eat goes into our compost bin. And it takes about a year probably to finish. And I do put, in addition to kitchen scraps, I put, I'm the weird guy in my block who gathers my neighbor's leaves up. Every year people come up to me and say, you don't have to bag the leaves or rake the leaves. And it's like, well, I'm bringing them to my house to add as a feedstock to my compost pile. And as been mentioned before, leaves are a good carbon source for the compost. So, you know, if I have a large amount of kitchen scraps going in, always have a stock of leaves somewhere that I can cover them up with. I also just use the leaves for mulch around garden beds, and I use the leaves for bedding also in the outside chicken run area for the chickens. I do put paper in my compost and cardboard. I divert a lot of mail that's paper into my compost bins as well. I had a class. I studied organic farming. I did a certificate program in organic farming at Michigan State in 2007, and had a 1-credit composting class with John Birnbaum, who was a great professor there. And but there was a lot of math in that class. There was a lot of carbon to nitrogen ratios, figuring it out. I struggled with that class, and I've since become very much a lazy composter. So I don't, you know, if the compost pile is getting really stinky, I'll add more carbon. It's almost never an issue for me, but it does take longer to break down. And one thing Professor Birnbaum always liked to emphasize in his class is that compost is really it's the foundation of an organic garden or farm, and that compost is creating it's a key component to creating a healthy soil, which leads to healthy food, which leads to healthy people. And yeah, I just like that little thing. I never, you know, I was taught not to put meat in compost. We don't eat a lot of meat in our house, so we don't have a lot of leftover meat or bones. And since it's such a small quantity in our kitchen, I will bury small amounts of meat or bones sometimes into my compost pile. It's never a large quantity, and it's never led to any, you know, the main reason I was taught not to do that is because it can attract rats. I've never seen rats in Kalamazoo. I've never had an issue. My bins are somewhat open, so we do have squirrels visit the compost bin to nibble, and possums and raccoons. And that doesn't bother me in any way. It's not a nuisance. So that's that. And another nice thing, it was mentioned not putting bread or baked goods into compost, and I don't do that. And that's a nice reason to have chickens. If we ever have extra bread or baked goods, chickens can have that. And, you know, then we have all of that, you know, cleaning out of the chicken coop and cleaning out of the chicken yard, which includes pine shavings and straw in the chicken waste. That all goes into our compost, and that really heats up the compost. That really raises the level of nitrogen and helps it break down faster. One thing I've been noticing this winter, it's been a little warmer this winter, and my piles have been breaking down faster. I don't know if anyone else has noticed their compost piles going down more. They usually just kind of sit static in the winter, but I'm noticing my pile getting smaller more than I've seen in winters past. So that's kind of interesting. Another thing I've done with winter composting, you know, it's not really composting very much, so you're kind of getting a pile of kitchen scraps on top of your compost pile. When I used to live in Ann Arbor and they have municipal composting, I would spend the winter just putting my kitchen scraps in a compost bin, and then in the springtime I would take them out of the compost bin and throw them into so I just used it as kind of a holding device for the winter time. What else? I think that's most of what I want to talk about regarding my experience composting. If you know, I live near Kalamazoo College. I have a very small yard. My neighbors don't notice my compost. It doesn't smell, even though it's kind of lazy and I'm just piling it and it's outdoors. If you live somewhere in the country, you don't even need, or if you have a larger yard, you don't even really need a physical bin. You can just pile your compost. You want to, you know, make it vertical and make the pile not spread out so it heats up. So you want to pile it high. And you can just have a pile on the ground. That's how I've done it on farms that I've worked on in the past. But since we live in the city, I like to kind of keep it a little bit more contained. My gardening style is very different from my next door neighbor, who's super, super clean and neat and mowed. And so, they already look at us like kind of odd gardeners. But so I just try to, have it look a little nicer for them. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Chris.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Chris Broadbent. I would say I'm in maybe year 3 of composting, and I operate a small scale, micro scale farm in the city of Kalamazoo, collecting compost currently, and working in a couple of methods that people have mentioned already, using the cold compost piles and the California bins, I think, that I saw a picture of from Dan in the past. And the purpose of my business is largely to help people compost if they currently cannot because of where they live or any circumstances that might prevent that. So I do pickup service, and then I also operate a couple of drop-off locations where customers can drop off their feedstock or kitchen scraps at the farm market or at my property. And I do as much of this as I can by bicycle, powered by bikes. I'm fortunate enough to ride have a cargo bike and several trailers in my fleet that make it somewhat possible to haul a bunch of compost and other materials across town in Kalamazoo, and maybe some other cities or townships outside in the county. And I believe it's possible for more people to be composting. So it's great to hear all the stories and people's experiences and what methods they're using. And obviously, it's wonderful to be part of this conversation where people are learning about enhancing their skill sets or developing further skills. For those who don't have the space outdoors or in their garden to compost, but still want to offset their feedstock, my business or other businesses or solutions like this might be an option. And I would just encourage any people who are either thinking about maybe doing something similar in their neighborhood, like starting a compost pile for their neighbors to use or something like that. Just consider not using fossil fuels or I guess electric cars in order to do that. And instead use bicycles, one of humanity's greatest tools. Almost as old as composting.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Lots of wonderful ideas and good suggestions. We have lots of recommendations and suggestions in the chat. We did have some questions too that if anybody would like to ask their questions and see who knows the answers, that'd be great. Steve.
Yeah, thank you all for your presentations and for your work. We also split our household stuff between chickens and compost, or what I used to call the raccoon feeder. So, I mean, I think if what you're calling lazy composting is a place where you dump stuff, that's what we have. But I'm sort of curious about the whole temperature thing. Is that just really slow? Is lazy composting just a lot slower? Or Dan, Chris, Janet, are your compost piles anaerobic? Do they get up to, what is it, 150, 160 degrees to kill off those seeds? You know, should I be doing something different than just feeding the raccoons? And can you do worm composting in an anaerobic pile that gets that hot? I guess that's two questions.
Well, we don't really worry all that much about the temperature of ours because especially with global warming, and I think as Dan was mentioning, this winter until very recently has been quite warm. So basically the warmer the weather, the faster the material you put in the compost bin decomposes. And if you don't have it open, you're supposed to add water periodically to help the process of decomposition. But you can really tell when it's done because it basically looks like black dirt. As I said, if you have the separate bins, one for the new compost and one for the old compost, you can just take the old compost out in the spring when you're ready to plow it into the garden. Just make sure it looks as though it's completely decomposed. We don't really check temperatures all that much. A lot of websites discuss composting with worms. And as I mentioned in the chat, the Environmental Protection Agency has a website that includes composting guidelines. So that might be one place that people could look at.
Yeah, and I would just say, yeah, it really has to do with time. If you're monitoring the temperature closely and altering your carbon and nitrogen ratios and being really good with keeping water on it, you can get it to break down faster. But for my needs in my garden, I have no need to do that. And I have bins big enough that it can hold what I need. And yeah, I had a job in the early 2000s in Chicago working with kids on a garden, and we would get spent beer grains from Goose Island, and that like supercharged the compost. That we would monitor the temperature because it was part of an education program, and it would heat up hot and break down really fast. So there are some, kind of feedstocks that you can put in and some management that you can do to make it break down faster. I don't know. I just there's just other gardening things I'd rather spend my time on.
I would just add, in my experience, I've had some not positive compost situations happening with the pile. And yeah, you got to tend to it and think of it like a recipe that you're preparing, that needs attention and also different components. So, monitoring that, I think it can be a really great maybe metaphor to think about in a lot of ways. And I'm sure, other people have other thoughts about that, but turning the pile, I like that New Year's resolution to turn the pile as much as possible.
So I guess, I'm sorry for jumping back in for a follow-up here, but my understanding is to get hot enough temperature to kill off seeds, it needs to be anaerobic. But
It needs to be aerobic.
Pardon?
It needs to be aerobic instead of anaerobic. So
To get that hot?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have, okay, good.
Could somebody tell us what those two terms mean?
Pardon?
Could somebody tell us what those two terms mean? I'm not familiar with them.
So aerobic means that it requires oxygen. So that's the microorganisms and the invertebrates are breaking down the waste. They need oxygen. So anaerobic is when the oxygen levels are below optimal, and you can still get compost that way, but it's quite a bit different. Pit composting is one of the ways to do it. I think Dan referred to that, where you can go down about 18 inches and bury things, but that's not going to be usable compost. That's a way of dealing with your waste. So you want it to be aerobic as much as possible. And that's one of the reasons you turn it.
Okay, thanks.
I have a friend who has a pit in his backyard next to his garden, nicely done with blocks around it instead of wood crates. But he puts in order to get oxygen into it, he has a PVC pipe that's, quite round, and he's drilled holes in it, and he puts that down into the middle of the pile, and he doesn't bother turning it, and he empties out his compost pile every other year. It's kind of a lazy way to do it, but it's a way of him getting oxygen into the middle of the pile.
I've seen those set up not only vertically in the middle, but you can go crossways too, and just put 3/8 inch holes in the PVC pipe, and you'll have lots of oxygen all the way through.
Yeah.
You can do that with a garbage can or something like that, and drill the holes outside to support the PVC pipes that are going through horizontally, and then do the vertical as well. It's a great idea.
And Steve, you're right about getting up to high enough temperatures to kill off weed seeds. My compost pile might not get high enough to kill off weed seeds, but I also I just don't put a lot of plants that have weed seeds in my compost pile. So that's one way I deal with that. A lot of times when I'm weeding, I just weed and mulch into whatever bed I'm weeding and just leave the weed material on the ground right there. And it might spread some weeds around. But I try to garden in a way that has plants packed in so densely that it's hard for weeds to kind of take hold. When I did work at the Gibbs house, we did have a lot of weeds that we pulled out of the ground there, and we had a separate pile that we composted those weeds. So we didn't compost them into the pile that was getting broken down and spread around the gardens as a way to limit the weed seed dispersal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've had some cherry tomatoes and strawberries from my compost that didn't get hot enough. It's not all bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, every year in our garden, we seem to have potatoes and squash and tomatoes that are all volunteers that come from
Yeah.
compost piles.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Joan asked about any advice for a congregation wanting to start a compost pile. We did that last year at Westminster. We have the circular bin that you rotate, and then also just some larger bins made of wood to hold the dry material. So I'm kind of anxious this spring to see, how much of it composted and what is there. We haven't gotten a whole lot of congregation members contributing to the compost, but I'm hoping maybe that will increase as we go along. But we just had a member that built the bins, and we bought the rotating composter, and we'll see what happens. It's right by our garden, so we have lots of things from the garden go into those.
Oh, that bin is for people to bring scraps from home?
Yes.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of education next to it to explain what goes in it, or?
Not next to it, but I did do that through some publicity.
Yeah.
Probably need to do it again every so often, but
Yeah.
we did try to give people advice about what to put in and what not to put in.
The person that initiated the project lives in a condominium and just can't do composting, has no space to do that. And so it's persons like that can't do it at home that really works for.
Mhm. Yeah.
A question for Eileen along that vein. I had thought I wanted to do composting at our church, and my thought was all the food waste from the food events at the church.
Mhm.
And now, of course, with COVID, we
Mhm.
haven't been using our kitchen, but
Right.
is that part of your program? Is there a lot of pushback about pests? And I want to be prepared for the pushback.
we immediately got pushback from our neighbor. And I said, no, there's no smell. And particularly if you don't put meat and dairy in, you really minimize any odor. So
Yeah.
it wasn't from the members itself, it was from our neighbors.
Yeah, and she was fine once we explained, what was happening and that it would be fine. Yes, we did have one picnic last summer where we had watermelon and that went into the compost pile. So yeah, leftovers from congregational events are a really good thing to put in it because it's right there. So,
Yes, we encourage people after Halloween at Temple B'nai Israel, the families to bring their Halloween pumpkins to our compost bin.
oh, that's a good
Oh,
idea.
great idea.
And that's when I pull out my machete, chop them up.
Yes, yes, yes. Obviously, it will decompose faster in pieces rather than
Right.
whole pumpkins.
Yeah.
It's great for stress management too. Whack.
Yeah. There's a question in the, I guess from Marty. Do you want to ask your question that you put in the chat?
I don't remember it.
Oh,
Go ahead, read it.
oh, no. Okay. Yeah, we did talk about the seeds. Never mind. It's the one from Toby.
Yeah.
A compost bin with no bottom or floor. Marty or Toby, why don't you explain that?
I have a compost bin that I paid for several years ago that is sides with slats and a lid and a place you lift to dig out the compost at the bottom. It's a lazy compost without any tumbling. But the tree roots grow right into the bottom of it. And I don't really have anywhere to put it that isn't gonna have tree roots grow into it and makes it really hard to dig out. The trees love the compost.
Is there any way you could add a bottom to it? Because most compost bins do have bottoms. I'm surprised that they're selling one without a bottom.
What would you recommend, Janet? What should I use for a bottom?
Wood, and anything that's not going to leach something bad into the compost.
Okay. All right, thank you. I had another question. I think it was for you too, Janet. Were you the one that mentioned the repurposing clothing?
Yes,
I'd like to know
yes.
where to do that. I have clothing that's not good enough to give to Goodwill or Salvation Army kind of thrift shops, and I hate to throw out. If I were a quilter, I'd be making new things, but I'm not.
Two things. Skylar Brez, who works for Gender and Women's Studies at Western, posted on the Nextdoor list. She's a friend of mine. She posted on the Nextdoor listserv recently that she wanted used clothing and tablecloths. I think she makes hats out of them or something. There are other people who do that. There are also bins where they ship used clothing abroad for people who have nothing, refugees and other individuals who have virtually nothing. So they would be quite grateful for something that we're tired of wearing.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that because I've been to Nicaragua a number of times, and all the donations of t-shirts from wealthy countries have really wrecked the native people's clothing businesses.
Okay.
It's been very hard on the economy to have that donated clothing when they would be making clothing themselves.
Okay, I was not aware of that. I'm sorry.
But I'd love to know if you had Skylar or whoever you said, could you put that in the chat, how to reach her?
You can reach her through the Gender and Women's Studies Department at Western. Her name is spelled Skylar, and her last name is BRE''EZ. So I can post that in the chat too. If you look her up under Gender and Women's Studies, you can send her an email.
Great, thank you.
along this line of Toby's question, I don't have an answer, but I read articles all the time about, oh, your blue jeans can get turned into insulation, or there was one a while ago that Nike was repurposing shoes, and they used it for 3 different things. Part of your shoe got made into running tracks, and another part got made into tennis courts and whatever. But then when you try to find out where in your own community, you know, maybe that's a project we could work on. We can do some research or something. Or even, what's that recycling center where you sign up? What is it called? And then you collect it and then you mail it to them. It's not recycle, is it upcycle, or everyone looks puzzled?
I've heard of that.
Nobody else knows.
But
I know what you're talking about, Marty. I did that with a lot of jeans. It costs nothing to send them by UPS, but I'll have to remember the name of that.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a
You're
topic
right.
to learn more and then to share about amongst this group.
Yeah, sounds great. Well,
I think I know the name of it. Are you talking about the one out of New Jersey that you put things in a box and send like your toothbrushes and toothpaste and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah.
It just left me too. It's kind of a
TerraCycle. It's
TerraCycle.
TerraCycle.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
it.
but then getting something going is, yeah, because you really need to do it on a group level, not as an individual.
And it would be fantastic to do like green teams at churches and stuff to get a box. I know Portage Northern did this, and they had the students bring in their old toothbrushes and old toothpaste tubes. And
Right.
then they don't charge to ship it. You just, get the box, get the label on there, and they
But
send you a
have to have
label.
you have to have some volume, and then if we work together so that we knew who was doing toothbrushes and who was doing chip bags and who was doing candy wrappers, who was doing disposable razors, so that there was choices to the whole
Yeah.
community.
Yeah, what a
It
great
sounds like
idea.
sounds like a great project that we can continue to work on. Our time is just about up. I would like to offer all of our speakers, if they have a last word or a closing comment that they'd like to say before we all sign off. So anybody have one more thing to add from our speakers?
I'd just like to say, anybody can feel free to contact me if you have questions. My husband is a master gardener, so he learned about composting in his master gardening classes when he took them. So,
Great.
and as I say, there are lots of good websites, such as the Environmental Protection Agency's website that have composting guidelines.
Great, thank you.
What I'd like to just reiterate is that you can do this stuff without knowing what you're doing. Just do it.
Yes.
Mhm.
And nature will take care of itself.
Yeah, and also to add to that, if you have ever considered yourself a brown thumb or not much of a gardener, composting kind of will catapult you into gardening, whether you want to or not. And it will become much easier when you have that constant flow of really fertile goodness to spread around your yard. It'll, it just, one thing leads to another. So yeah, composting is really kind of the first step towards a really nice garden.
Rick had his hand up.
Yeah, I put it in the chat beforehand and then it got wiped out, but I'd like to announce that we're doing our next styrofoam recycling at Mayor's Riverfront Park on the 29th, Saturday, the 29th, from 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. And so bring your styrofoam down there and it doesn't go into the landfill.
Great, thank you, Rick, for that reminder.
And Anna and I will both be there with thick gloves on.
Thank you. Thank you.
And anybody else that wants to help out. It's light work.
I haven't missed one. It's a lot of fun.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Toby.
Yeah, and it's light work. It's nice and light.
Any other closing comments?
Thank
Well,
you.
I would like to say I'm a rookie composter. And what John had to say gave me peace of mind because I don't know how soon I have to take it out of I have a rotary bin. And I started probably late last summer, and I haven't done anything with it yet. And I guess I can just chill and wait for the right time. So thank you, John.
Yeah, wait till spring. It'll be there. That's great. Okay, well, thank you
I
so
would
much.
just say in parting, compost happens.
Yes.
Yes, it
I'm
does.
wondering about the connection between not raking your leaves. Somebody here talked a lot about how many browns you need compared to the table scraps, the kitchen scraps. And I've been reading more about how we should be just using our leaves for mulch. So that's maybe another possibility for another green team, but also for a project that instead of the city collecting so much leaves, we could be encouraging people how to use them.
I know you can do that with, for example, when you mow your lawn, there's some lawn mowers that are designed to be mulching lawn mowers, and they'll hack the grass up enough so that it doesn't inhibit growth, and it just serves as a nice mulch. We have one of those. So then we don't have to rake the grass after we mow. It just sort of stays there. And the birds like that because they'll use it for their nests, and they'll use the grass for their nests and stuff like that.
We have an electric battery powered lawnmower, and I just mowed the grass in the fall with all the leaves on it, and it just broke up the leaves into tiny pieces, and I didn't rake at all for the first time ever. And the leaves that I did need to rake because they were on the sidewalk, the driveway, etc., I took those all to the YWCA because they needed them for their composter, because my daughter-in-law works in that kitchen. So I knew they were begging for things to go with all of their table scraps to complement them. So I think there's a project there that we want to take on that one too.
Okay, thank you, everybody. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we really appreciate all of our panelists and all of the people who came to listen and discuss and talk, and
See you in the morning.
lots of ideas there. So
Thank you for organizing
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
you're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Same to you.
Happy New